and welcome back to another GiantSlayerTV Synergies tier list video. Today our analysts will be ranking each synergy from S all the way down to C tier for patch 11.3. The meta is relatively diverse, though that diversity could be argued against as a lot of the compositions revolve around hitting 3-star champions. But in terms of synergies, you're able to use a wide array of them depending on what your comp ends up being. Keep in mind that the strength between each tier matters mainly for consistency, as every synergy is playable under the right circumstance. With all that said, let's go ahead and dive on in. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come. Be sure to also follow our GiantSlayerTV social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. To begin with, we have the synergies in the S tier. This tier consists of Executioner, Warlord, Daredevil, Blacksmith, and Vanguard. These synergies have a lot of influence on the current meta and are used consistently most games. At the tippity top of S tier, we have Executioner. The synergy is basically represented entirely by Kayle, as she is one of the best, if not the best, carries in the game currently, or at least one of the best carries for non-reroll builds. Executioner will boost her damage by a significant amount, especially since fitting in 3 Executioner is relatively easy to do. Besides Kayle, both Xayah and Kindred are strong champions in the meta. Xayah is still popular for Elderwood comps and does well as a secondary carry in Executioner compositions. Kindred is just an all-around solid 3-cost champion that you can play on your board from the early game well into the mid-game. All in all, Executioner is a solid synergy with really great champions. Up next, we have Warlord. Warlord is possibly the best vertical trait, as 6 Warlords often dominate the mid-game. This can be achieved either with Nidalee by 3-starring her or with Katarina. Late game, both of these champions still scale surprisingly well, especially since Nidalee with proper items can basically one-shot anything. Overall, this synergy thrives in a meta that favors rerolling for 3-star champions, as it has 2 viable carries and scales well with upgraded champions. Next, we have 2 individual synergies, Daredevil and Blacksmith. Daredevil, or Samira, is definitely the best 5-cost carry champion in the current meta. Yone is much better after being buffed, but Samira just does more damage. Of course, we are in a meta that doesn't really favor 5-cost champions, so Samira may not always find a way into your comp. But if you're able to get to the late game and need additional damage for your build, she is for sure the best option. As for Blacksmith, well, it's less about Ornn as a champion and has much more to do with his artifacts. In general, all of the artifacts have a large impact on the game once you get them, and in some cases increase the power of your board by a significant amount. Ornn himself is alright, he's the Vanguard with crowd control, but he's really only used to produce artifact items. And the last synergy in S tier is Vanguard. Vanguard earns this spot mainly because it provides good frontline champions with crowd control. This makes it incredibly easy to use them in practically any comp except those that are using Brawler or Elderwood as their frontline. For every other player, when you need a frontline, you're almost always going to benefit from adding in Vanguard with champions like Aatrox, Sejuani, or Ornn. Alright, that's it for S tier, so let's move on to the synergies in A tier. This tier consists of Slayer, Divine, Duelist, Spirit, Syphoner, Ninja, Brawler, Mage, and Mystic. These synergies are commonly used in top 4 compositions and are all around consistently useful. First up, we have Slayer, which is a relatively flexible trait. This flexibility is mainly thanks to Olaf, Zed, and Samira all being viable carry options. That said, both Olaf and Zed require specific items, so it can be difficult to run Slayer every game. But when you do get those items and hit proper upgrades, Slayer is a really good carry trait. Divine is back as a relevant synergy after it received another mini rework in patch 11.3. Although the strength of the trait matters less than the champions, as both Nasus and Kayle are currently used as carries in very different builds. But since those 2 champions are popular in the meta, it also has increased the popularity and consistency of Divine. With rerolling being such a common aspect of the meta, it's no surprise that Duelist is up in the A tier for this patch. Duelist is the quintessential reroll trait of Set 4, as that has been its calling card ever since Set 4 originally came out. And it's absolutely thriving in this meta, as Yasuo, Fiora, Jax, and Kalista are all champions you can realistically 3-star. Set 4.5 has seen a sharp decline in the amount of usable splash traits, as there's far more vertical synergies being played. But there are still a few splash traits that are commonly played, with Spirit being one of them. Committing 2 champions for increased attack speed to your whole board is definitely worth it, especially since champions like Kindred and Yuumi are easy to fit into a lot of comps. Another strong splash trait is Syphoner, as it really synergizes well with any fast attacking champions or those with high magic damage. It's also relevant in the meta thanks to the Nasus reroll comp. But for the most part, if you're looking to use Syphoner, it will be to boost the strength of certain carries. We've mentioned Slayer and Spirit, how about Ninja? And by Ninja, we really mean Zed, as he's the most commonly used ninja in the meta, especially since playing him as the carry with Spirit and Slayer is easy to do. But he's not the only viable ninja carry, as Akali is definitely playable, though far more difficult to play consistently than Zed is. Brawlers are amazing early game, fall off a bit in the mid game, and get strong again late game if you're committing to Shyvana and 8 Brawlers. We're in a reroll meta, so anytime you can reroll for a 3-star carry, chances are that composition is gonna be decent. In the case of Brawlers, you will still need a little more than just Shyvana 3, but with 8 Brawler and Set, you should be able to consistently finish in the top 4. Mage has fallen off a lot after the B patch, and the meta shifted towards rerolling. While you can play to reroll Twisted Fate, Brand, or Vanguard, really when you think about Mage, you're going to be thinking about Aurelion Sol. Aurelion is still incredibly strong, but difficult to get going consistently thanks to the meta speeding up quite a bit with reroll builds and a lot of AoE damage between Kayle, Olaf, and Samira. That said, if you can hit Aurelion Sol 2 with good items and upgraded Elderwoods, you'll be in a good spot for top 4. And the last trait in the A tier is Mystic. Not much needs to be said, Mystic is still a strong splash trait. The main issue is that Mystic doesn't always provide enough magic resist to matter, especially in a meta with either high magic damage in the case of Nidalee and Katarina, or true damage in the case of Kayle. But it's still easy to fit into Mystic into most compositions, so the trait inherently gains a lot of value. Let's move on to the B tier synergies. This tier consists of Sharpshooter, Exile, Dragonsoul, Elderwood, Assassin, Emperor, Adept, the Boss, and Cultist. Overall, these synergies are capable of doing well in the meta, but for the most part are just average at best. Sharpshooter is in an interesting position because Nidalee is one of the best 3-star champions in the game, so using the synergy with her is quite good. But Sharpshooter doesn't really have much else going for it besides a niche Tristana 3 build. We're keeping it at the top of B tier because Nidalee does use it, but this synergy could very well be lower in the next patch if Nidalee 3 is nerfed. Exile is doing alright, Yone is still a decent champion late game, and Yasuo is a strong early game champ. Overall, it doesn't really stand out as that important, but it's a nice defensive boost for both of its champions. Dragonsoul is on the rise in the meta, but isn't quite there yet. It may very well become far more popular as the meta continues to evolve. As a trait, it has a lot going for it with Olaf, Swain, and Shyvana using the buff well, but the issue, much like the original Darkstar trait in set 3, is getting the buff onto the right champion. If you end up having it stuck on, say, Braum, it's not going to do much for you. All in all, it's not as bad of a synergy as it was last patch, but still hasn't quite found a consistent place in the meta. Despite being in the B tier, Elderwood is not doing that poorly. It's still the best synergy to run with Aurelion Sol, but both the trait and Aurelion mainly lack consistency, especially in a faster paced meta like the one we're currently in. Because other players are hitting power spikes around the time you're getting an Elderwood board going, you may often find yourself being outscaled before your board reaches its potential. Overall, it's not like Elderwood is doing badly, it's just difficult to use well right now. Assassin is one of those traits that you're going to want to use because of champions like Katarina, Akali, or even Talon. But it's not the type of trait you really want to use because the benefits it gives tend to be lackluster, especially in comparison to similar traits like Ninja. That all said, Assassin is an essential piece in the current meta, so you're going to use it, even if it's just to gain spell crit for champions like Katarina and Akali. 5-cost champions have taken a bit of a backseat in the current meta since it's so focused on the mid-game with reroll comps and Kayle. Thus, champions like Azir with Emperor can be difficult to fit into a lot of boards. But the saving grace for Emperor is that the Sand Guardians are quite useful as corner baits against things like Aatrox and Aurelion Sol. Plus, Azir is a Warlord, which is also one of the best synergies in the current meta. Adept continues to be a somewhat below average splash trait. Don't get us wrong, it's still really good, but a lot of the time it's either difficult to fit into your build, or there are other splash synergies better suited for your board like Spirit or Syphoner. There's also the issue of Quicksilver countering it, as that's an essential item for Kayle, plus Olaf just ignores the slow with his ultimate. Overall, it's still a really good synergy, but fitting it into your board can be quite difficult. The Boss, or Set, is great for Brawlers. In fact, he's basically essential for them to do well in the late game. And he's good against them, but with 5 cost not being as useful in the current meta, it's often difficult to use Set. Basically consider him a niche 5 cost when you're playing Brawlers or playing against them if you need an easy counter to them. And the last synergy in the B tier is Cultist. Honestly, Cultists are doing much better than the last patch, as they're back to being a useful early and mid-game 6-piece synergy. The main issue that continues to plague them is the lack of a viable carry outside of the early game, since there's no Jhin-like champion to lean on. And now we can move into the last tier, C tier. This tier consists of Keeper, Enlightened, Fabled, and Fortune. These synergies are useful in the right situation, but have less of an impact on the meta than the tiers above them. Keepers are pretty good champions, with Rakan and Elise holding down the early game, and Xayah with Azir doing alright late game. But with Elderwoods not being used all the time, the fact is Keeper has far less of a role in the overall meta than it did before. Still, it's strong early game and common to use with Elderwoods. Enlightened suffers from being a synergy that doesn't add enough value to its champions. Talon and Morgana are both great champions, but Talon cares more about items and damage than he does about mana gain, and Morgana naturally gains a lot of mana from being a frontline champion. Janna is still the only unit where the additional mana gain matters, but she's only relevant early game, so the trait is just lacking in general. Fabled has a design issue. Basically, the Fabled champions have to be weaker to compensate for the power they gain with Fabled. This means that running any Fabled champion without Fabled can be quite underwhelming. Cho'Gath luckily does have good CC, so he's still valuable, but Nautilus is basically just an early game frontliner, and Nico has no real practical use outside of Fabled builds. And the last synergy for our tier list is Fortune. Honestly, Fortune is an amazing synergy when the player knows how to use it well. It can practically win you the game if you play it well and get a decent payout. But for most players, Fortune is a trap. The lure of a big payout is going to bait players into running it too long and paying the price for it. So while Fortune is really good for specific players, it's pretty bad for most. That's all we have for today's tier list video. The meta continues to evolve each day, which is good to see after a somewhat stagnant beginning to set 4.5. That said, we are seeing vertical 6-piece traits be more and more common, with splash traits being less relevant, which does make flexible play much harder to do. Let us know in the comment section below which synergies you're having the most success with, and what changes you're hoping to see in patch 11.4. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.